Okay, class, this is Unit 3 Development. This is the 6th video. This is looking at adulthood. I would look at page 14, 15, and 16 in your packet to take your notes. This is going to cover all adulthood. It's going to cover the biological perspective, the psychological perspective, and the social perspective in the development of an adult. So first, let's talk about the emerging adulthood. For some people in modern cultures, a period from the late teens to mid-20s, there's a bridge in the gap between adolescence, dependence, and full independence, and the responsible adult. This is known as the emerging adult. So emerging adult spans between the ages of 18 to 25. During this time, young adults may live with their parents and attend college or work. On average, emerging adults may marry in their mid-20s. But at this point in time, a lot of emerging adults aren't really seen as dependent, or independent, I should say, and are still depending on their parents. So they're not classified in that real adult state yet. Okay, so what is adulthood? Although adulthood begins sometime after the mid-20s, defining adulthood into stages is more difficult than defining the stages of a childhood or adolescence. So it's really hard to define when maybe a particular enters adulthood and the different stages they're going to enter in adulthood, because every adult approaches the stages of life differently. It centers on it's the center of a person's life. It pretty much looks at adolescent to old age. Development continues into adulthood, physically, cognitively, and socially. So a lot of times people thought that development it ends at adolescent, but really we continue to develop as adults, whether it's physically, cognitively, or socially. Like I said before, it's harder to generalize about adult stages because everybody goes through the adult process in a different way. So let's start with physical development. The peak of physical performance usually occurs around your mid-20s. Sorry to say, you're coming to an end, class. After which it declines rather quickly. Athletes are usually the first to notice. Women who usually mature early peak earlier. And adolescents rarely notice this too much in their 20s if they don't exert a lot of a physical activity. But if there's somebody that's very physical, they're an athlete, or there's somebody that runs triathlons or marathons, they may begin to notice their physical performance weaning off. Physical changes in mid-adulthood. So fertility begins to gradually decline in women. In the 40s and 50s, menopause might impact women. This is a time of natural cessation of menstruation. It also refers to the biological changes a woman experiences as her ability to reproduce declines. Fertility does not decrease so much for men. They do expect to have a lower sperm count, testosterone level, and speed of erection. Overall strength in early adulthood slowly begins to decline as well, and overall speed and endurance of a young adult is also going to begin to decline. Okay, later adulthood, so older adulthood, some of the misconceptions. Older adult people are more susceptible to short-term illness. That's a misconception. Brain neurons all die. Misconception. Everyone over the age of 90 becomes senile. That's a misconception. And then everybody's memory begins to fade. That's another misconception. A big thing that we're learning is the life expectancy, which is the estimated time someone will live, is actually increasing. And it has increased over the last 20 years. We are the biggest population of older age adults the world has ever seen. And that could be due to the advancements in technology. We're actually able to save younger infants, so they're beginning to live longer. Women usually outlive men by 4 years. Life expectancy can be impacted by stress and diet. There is an interesting idea that was mentioned in the book, which was called death deferral phenomenon, which they studied life expectancy and they studied the time in which some people end up dying. And they did a research study for 15 years, and they found that they measured how many people die on Christmas Day and how many people die a couple days after, and they found that 3,000 people actually are more prone to die 2 days after Christmas than actually on Christmas. So whether this is a correlation where more people end up dying 2 days later, it is something kind of interesting that maybe our body tells us to kind of hold on for those last couple days. And then they found an average of 3,000 more people die 2 days later. I thought that that was an interesting kind of point to point out to you. Other sensory changes that do happen, however, for older aged adults, visual sharpness diminishes, their eyes begin to their retinas and pupils begin to deteriorate a little bit. The muscle strength and reaction time are slower. Hearing and detecting of tones also begins to decline, and we'll look at that in sensation unit. Sometimes older generations can't hear a certain ringtone because their threshold's lower. Taste is intact until later in life, but taste begins to decline usually later in life. Men tend to lose their hearing and taste earlier than women. And so here you can kind of see the declining of, at the age of 10 to the age of 90, the vision begins to decrease here. The percent of correct identifying of smells begins to decrease. You have about 90 years old, you can only probably detect about 60% of it. And then you can also hearing spoken words. You can see by 5, you can really identify those sounds, but by the age of 70, 80, and 90, it's beginning to decrease about, what would you say, 30% there. Health of older adults, the immune system begins to weaken, and you're more susceptible to things like cancer and pneumonia. However, during your life, you also accumulate a lot of antibodies, so you're able to fight off illnesses such as the common cold or the flu. So it's kind of a plus or minus. Your immune system weakens, so you're more susceptible to those life-threatening illnesses. However, you can fight off those things like the common cold and the flu. At the age of 70, also, our motor abilities decline. A 70-year-old is no match for a 20-year-old individual. You can kind of see if you look at the age and years on the bottom here. So you got a 20-year-old, pretty much from a 25-year-old to about a 60-year-old. You're less likely to get into car accidents, and then as your age increases, you're more prone, kind of because of the reaction time and your motor ability, you're more prone to get in accidents. To mention, Alzheimer's is another section of the text where your brain physically begins to deteriorate here. It's a substantial loss of brain cells. Can lead to 2 things. The first one is dementia, and the second one is Alzheimer's. A lot of people use these interchangeably, but what dementia is, it's a mental erosion of the brain. It can be caused by tumors, strokes, or alcohol dependence. It's more of a list of symptoms, such as memory loss. Okay, if you have dementia, it can turn into Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease really impacts your memory, and gradually you begin to deteriorate. It strikes 3% of the world's population by 75. It could lead to things like dementia, which is the erosion of the brain, but a lot of the times dementia can turn into things like Alzheimer's. Memory deterioration occurs, then reasoning begins to decline. You diminish your sense of smell, your emotions begin to go flat, like you're not emotional anymore, you get disorientated, and then finally you're kind of mentally vacant. Usually you can live with Alzheimer's for about 5 to 15 years, depending on how fast you begin to deteriorate. And we're tying it back to that acetylcholine, that neurotransmitter. There's not a high production of acetylcholine, and there's the deterioration of them, so hence it's going to link to a lot of memory loss. Okay, now we're looking at cognitive development. Do cognitive abilities like memory, creativity, and intelligence also decline with age the same way as physical abilities do? Okay, so aging and memory, usually when older adults were asked to reflect back on a time, usually they remember memories, which was kind of interesting, they pick a memory from adolescent or the mid-20s. They say that this might have to do with a lot of happiness and first in an individual's time. So first kiss, their first dance, their first relationship. So these are kind of their first child. So these are some exciting times for the individual. Usually recalling information is very challenging for somebody in this age group. So recalling names would be something that's very hard for them. So as your teachers get older, from pure memory, it's probably harder for them to recall a name versus maybe they see it on a list and it's easier for them to, recognition is easier for them. So for kind of the first couple days of school, it's kind of hard for me to recall your names from pure memory. However, if I see them on an attendance list, it's a little bit easier, like, oh yes, this person is here. I see them on the list. I know that is their name. As we age, we remember some things well. These are kind of what I was talking about before. These include the recent past events and events that happened a decade or two back. However, remembering names becomes increasingly difficult. I thought this was an interesting graph. Okay, so when you're 18 to 39, you remember their first name, usually 30% of the time after the introduction. Okay, the second time you hear it, you maybe remember it 70% of the time, and then after hearing it 3 times, you may tend to remember it 90% of the time. Okay, but when you are 70 to 90 years old, okay, after the first introduction, you might only remember it 10% of the time. And then as they grow, they hear it a second time, they may only remember it 30% of the time. And then recalling that name, if they are introduced a third time, they may only be able to recall it 50% of the time, or a little less than 50. So you can see how memory or recall begins to decline in individuals. Continuing with cognitive development here, cognitive development continues through adulthood. Some abilities improve and some abilities decline. One thing that we're going to talk about is fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence. You have 2 different types of intelligence. Fluid intelligence is how quickly you can respond to something, and our fluid intelligence usually peaks at our 20s and then declines hereafter. So it's our ability to reason speedily and abstractly, and it tends to decrease during our late adulthood. So if you were given your math facts or your times table, okay, how quickly you can respond to those may begin to decrease over time. Crystallized intelligence is the amount of knowledge or verbal skills. It still continues to increase in time. Okay, so your crystallized intelligence, the stuff I always think that it's like it's remaining, it's crystallized within you. So maybe it's things like vocab terms, or your language in terms of all the different knowledge that you know. It's still going to remain within you. However, how quickly you respond, it could be slower because that's the fluid intelligence. Okay. Overall, individual rates vary depending on the lifestyle and health as well. But these are the 2 things that they've seen with cognitive development. Okay, so it is believed today that fluid intelligence, the ability to reason speedily, declines with age, but crystalline intelligence, our accumulated knowledge and skill, does not. We gain vocabulary knowledge, but lose recall memory and process more slowly. Okay, aging and intelligence, a number of cognitive abilities decline with age. However, again, our vocabulary and general knowledge increase with age. Okay, so kind of what I was talking about before. Okay, let's kind of talk about how they figured this information out. They did use 2 types of studies. They used cross-sectional, okay, which they used many a study in which people of different ages were compared to one another. Okay, this should be something that we learned with research. They also looked at longitudinal study where they researched people over 1 or 2 people or a group of people, and they're restudied over a long period of time. So they studied somebody's crystallized and fluid intelligence over a long period of time, okay, to see the differences and what happened to the individual. Alright, so now we're turning to social development. There are many differences between the young and old adult that are not based on physical and cognitive abilities, but may instead be based on life events associated with family, relationship, and the workplace. Big events in a social development of an adult would be the workplace, marriage, and whether or not they have children. Okay. Love and work are the defining themes in adults' kind of life, kind of what I talked about in a moment ago, whether they commit themselves with an individual and their work in which they do. Evolutionary psychologists believe the commitment has a survival value. Parents that stay together are likely to leave a viable future for future generations. So we're back to Erikson here. Intimacy versus isolation is a major stage in which adults kind of deal with. This is from that mid-20s, maybe to mid-30s. They begin to ask questions such as, should I live alone or should I be attached to someone? Are they willing to share commitment, emotional ties, values? Are they sharing interest and intimate disclosures with somebody else? They found studies with marriage, and marriages usually last. People that are married after 20 and are more educated. So that was some of the studies that was revealed in the book. Okay, generativity versus stagnation is the next stage that adults go through. It's that midlife transition, usually in the early 40s. They begin to kind of question, are they productive and are they helping future generations? Are they satisfied with their workplace? Sometimes they enter a midlife crisis. This is the transition period. They kind of understand that there's more of life behind them than ahead of them. Work often defines a person at this point in time. They describe themselves by what they do. Oh, I'm a teacher, or oh, I'm a dentist. Okay, the larger population that is unhappy do not grow at this time. So if you're unhappy with your life, a lot of times you can't find yourself being successful and happy. You're worried about the social clock. Okay, what's kind of occurring, what are the events that are taking place in your life. So the social clock is the culturally preferred timing of social events such as marriage, parenthood, and retirement. You're kind of thinking of the pressure of the social clock at this time. Happiness, kind of adult commitments. If more prone adults that are happy find happiness from work and jobs that fit their interests and provides a sense of competence and accomplishment, so they find happiness in their workplace. Towards the end of one's life, then they have integrity versus despair. So they begin to question, did I contribute to society? Did I live to my fullest potential? Am I happy? Do I have everything off my bucket list? And so you're really you have a sense of integrity. You're happy, you're self-fulfilled, or maybe you're looking at one's life as kind of in despair. Okay, so death and dying is a part of the lifespan process. Usually it is more seen at the end of one's life, towards the, I would say, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. People in this time period see a lot of their friends, maybe their spouses, pass away or die. Okay, so they have to go through the process of grief. Now, it does happen sometimes, unfortunately, in the earlier stages, and how we as individuals, maybe in our teens, our 20s, our 30s, and how we cope with grief can happen at any time. Okay, the grief is a loss or the emptiness after one's death. Okay, the normal range of reactions of a loved one varies. So somebody could be very hard or hit very hard and go through the process, and it could take years to overcome. Somebody might transition because of maybe their support system, or because of the busyness of their life schedule, because of their having a kid, and can transition a little bit faster, but it's never easy. Okay, grief is usually more severe if the death is unexpected. So they may struggle with the grief if they never got the opportunity to kind of say goodbye. Kind of integrity here, if somebody is finding out that they are dying, and they've been given kind of that unfortunate life sentence, a lot of times if they have integrity, kind of talking about integrity versus despair, they know they've lived a really good life. They are more accepting of the future hands that they're dealt. However, if they're kind of in the earlier stages of Erikson's development, they're in intimacy versus isolation, or they're in generativity versus stagnation. They have a lot left to go. They may not be as accepting as what's ahead of them. So Kubler-Ross stated that there's 5 stages that somebody may go through in terms of the grief process. Okay, the first one that most people usually go through is denial. Okay, they're unaccepting of it. They're unaccepting of themselves, maybe getting diagnosed with something, or you could be kind of in denial that it happened to your parent or it happened to your sibling. Okay, so the denial process can work kind of both ways. The second one is you're angry. You're just bitter. It's not fair. Why is this happening to me? Okay, and at the same time, it could be that, you know, you're getting diagnosed with something, you don't want it, and you're angry, or maybe you're really upset because it happened to a parent. Why was it you're just very angry, you're lost? Why was it you versus maybe somebody else? Okay, the next stage is you begin to bargain. All right, so if I really work out and I eat healthier, give me a couple more days and I'll change as a person. Don't do this to me yet. So you kind of begin like asking questions. Well, please don't do this to me yet. I'll try better. And that could be the same thing as like if you lost a parent. You begin to bargain. Well, come on, give them one more day with me and I'll do this for you. Okay, you could be talking to a higher being, or you could just be bargaining kind of with yourself, talking to yourself kind of thing. Then a lot of the times you just hit a depression. You're sad, you have, your heart is so broken. Maybe you don't want to interact with your friends or your social environment. Maybe you don't go out anymore. And that can last, any of these can last a couple weeks, or it could last a couple months. And then the last one, you don't really want to do it, but you accept it. Whether it's you, the acceptance of maybe you're dealing with a terminal cancer and you kind of accept like the end is near, I'm going to live my day to the fullest, or you accept somebody's death. So it can work both ways. Sometimes you re-enter the cycle again. You go through the stages once more: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But a lot of the times people who are dealing with grief or death pretty much go through these stages. Okay, so to kind of recap, the first thing we kind of talked about is this is all adulthood. We talked about the biological changes. The big one we talked about was menopause for women. We talked about the psychological changes, memories, deterioration. We talked about fluid versus crystallized intelligence. And then we talked about big things that happen in the social area. We talked about the stages of grief, the social clock, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and integrity versus despair, which is not on there.